Good morning, everyone. I'm Don Groth. I'm the plant pathologist here at the rice station in Crowley. Today I want to talk a little bit about rice disease management. I know in the northeast Louisiana you guys have a lot of interest in the row rice, and the number one disease in row rice is rice blast. It's probably the number one disease in the world. It causes extreme damage to rice, and we're like sheath blight, which is our most common disease in Louisiana, can take maybe 15 to 20% under worst case scenarios. Under worst case scenarios for blast, you might be left with 15 to 20% of your yield. So you need to be very careful about how you manage rice blast, especially in upland rice. We're here in what we call our leaf blast nursery, and what this is we try to evaluate rice varieties, breeding materials, germplasm under heavy disease conditions. And we do a number of things here that increase the amount of disease pressure. The first one you're going to see is we're in upland rice. Blast is 5 to 10 times worse when you don't have a field flooded. We keep these plots watered, so the ground's moist, but we do not flood them, and that makes blast much worse. The second thing we do is plant very late. Our regular planting dates are from early March to mid-April. We wait until May to plant these nurseries. That's because blast gets worse as the season gets along. Inoculum from early planted fields comes up and spreads to later planted fields, and so blast is worse in later planted fields. I don't know if you can tell, it's a little bit late now, but we use higher nitrogen rates. We go above the recommended rates, and all the diseases that we have in rice are favored by high nitrogen. Sheath blight, blast, bacterial panicle blight, and cercospora are all worse when you use higher nitrogen rates. We also plant very thick stands, so the canopy is thick and it holds moisture. All of our diseases need moisture to develop. And the final thing that we do here is, I don't know if you can see it completely, but when we get a little bit better, closer look, is we'll plant what we call a susceptible spreader. It's a California variety, M201. It has no known resistance genes, so it gets every race of blast, and we put this out here to collect windborne spores. They land on the M201, then it generates the inoculum to infect the other plants. This is one of those cases of do as I say, not as I do. And this gives you an opportunity to talk about some of the things you don't want to do. The first thing is, under normal rice management, get that flood on as early as possible and keep it on. If you lose the flood, it becomes much more susceptible. The big thing is with the row rice, maybe if you can back flood in some of the areas, it will help some. But the upper ends that isn't flooded, you're still going to have upland conditions. The second is plant early. The earlier you plant, the less blast you have. It's just a case of, later in the season, more disease. And think about when you're in your marketing plans, you might have some susceptible varieties and resistant varieties that you want to grow. Always plant the susceptible varieties first, and then plant the resistant ones. Also, use the recommended amount of nitrogen. I know that's there's a lot of differences in opinions on row rice on how much nitrogen you should use, but don't get excessive. Don't try to push the rice with nitrogen. You're just going to make it more susceptible and more blast things. The fourth thing is, if a lot of rice is being planted to a certain variety, try to mix it up. You don't want all your eggs in one basket. That's very important in disease management, because fields will feed upon each other. You have the inoculum being produced in the field, but when you get a lot of susceptible varieties, you're going to have inoculum come from other field, and that increases the disease pressure. Good example of that was in 2012 when we had over 50% of our varieties were one variety was CL151, a very susceptible variety. Environmental conditions were favorable. We had a very susceptible host, and the pathogen was able to build up and cause a lot of damage. As I mentioned, in our blast nursery, we evaluate resistance to rice leaf blast in this nursery. And we use a 0 to 9 scale, 0 being no disease, and 9 being a plant completely dead. And you can see right here, we've got one variety right next to here. There's not a single blast lesion on it. This row right next to it, treated exactly the same, it's completely dead. We also have a lot of varieties that are moderately resistant to moderately susceptible. And they're going to have some lesions on the lower canopy, but they tend to not be as bad or as good as the other extremes. So if there's one take-home message I want you to get is make sure you know what the reaction of your variety is before you plant it, because there's a world of difference between some of the varieties. And an easy way to find that out is we have the rice varieties and management tips publication, and in the back there's a table that has all the varieties. Some of that information comes from this nursery that tells you which each variety, if it's resistant to very susceptible to these diseases. That's very important to pick the most resistant materials you can have, because in the upland conditions, blast can be a bioherbicide. One of the important tools besides resistance is fungicides. We have a number of good fungicides that have good activity against blast. Both of them are in the strobilurin chemistry. One is azoxystrobin, that's Quadris, Quilt XL, and Amistar Top. We also have trifoxystrobin, which is Gem and Stratego. And one interesting thing is next year Bayer is not going to be marketing Stratego. They're going to be marketing a compound called Flint, and what that is basically the pure trifoxystrobin similar to Gem, but they're going to be calling it Flint next year. And if you want to get a tank mix of the propiconazole with the trifoxystrobin, you'll have to tank mix it yourself because you won't be able to get Stratego available. Trifoxystrobin is probably the best blast material we have available. It's a little bit weaker against sheath blight, but the blast activity is better than anything else we have available. The azoxystrobin has good blast activity, but it's not as strong as trifoxystrobin, but it is a better sheath blight material. One thing you need to know is understand the disease cycle of blast before you use a fungicide. Blast has two phases to it. Leaf blast, which you see here, starts at early tillering, and about time the plant enters reproductive stage, panicle initiation, panicle differentiation, leaf blast tends to die down. And this is an example right here. This variety, it had a lot of leaf blast early in the season, and now it's started to grow out. But if the only time I recommend a fungicide for leaf blast is if the rice is dying. Under normal rice management, the best thing to do if you have leaf blast is to make sure the field's completely flooded, increase the flood, make sure all that soil is covered. We're not trying to flood out the blast, we're just trying to make sure that all the soil is covered with water. And with the upland conditions, you can do some back flooding, but you're not going to be able to completely flood the field, so you have to deal with that. The only time I recommend a fungicide, as I said, was if the rice is dying. You may have, if it's looking like this, you don't want to let it get to this stage because it's not going to come back. You want to, if you have a lot of leaf blast, you might have to put out an aerial application. What I recommend is put out the full recommended rate of these products. 12 ounces of Quadris, 4 or 5 ounces of Gem, 19 ounces of Stratego. The second part of blast is it kind of dies down the leaf blast, but that leaf blast stays in the canopy and continues to produce inoculum. It comes up out of the canopy, and that's what infects the head. And that, when it affects that node right below the head, that's called neck blast. If it gets bad enough, that neck breaks off, and that's called what they call rotten neck blast. Sometimes they'll actually attack nodes on the panicle, and that's called panicle blast. Each one of those conditions stops the nutrient flow from the stems and leaves and stops the grain from filling. So you're going to lose yield and milling quality. The important thing about that is you have to hit the correct growth stage to control that disease, and that's 50 to 70% of the heads emerging. Not completely emerge. If you see a bunch of heads sticking out of the field, you're too late. It's 50 to 70% boot split and on, basically, what you're calling. With a moderately resistant, moderately susceptible, and a susceptible variety that there's not too much leaf blast, a single application at heading will be very effective. You can get 80, 90, 95% control of blast. Now, if you have a very susceptible variety, or a susceptible variety with a lot of leaf blast, like you have a situation here, you have a lot of leaf blast, there's so much inoculum being produced that the fungicide doesn't have a chance to control the disease. None of our fungicides are 100% effective. We're managing them, we're not completely controlling them. So what we need to do in those situations, very susceptible varieties with lots of leaf blast, we have to have a boot application, 2 to 4 inch panicle in the boot, and come back with a heading application. All the boot application does is reduce the amount of inoculum in the field, so you don't have as much disease pressure, so the heading application has a chance. The heading application does most of the work in there. If you just put out a boot application, there's still enough inoculum, you're going to get rotten neck and neck blast. So be very careful about how you manage your fungicides. The next thing is talk just a little bit about some of the other diseases. Sheath blight's our most important disease. A boot to heading application does a very good job. I don't know exactly how bad sheath blight can be in upland furrow irrigated rice, but if you have sheath blight, that application. So like if you have sheath blight and blast, use that heading application. Make sure you control the blast. With the smuts, which I know you have a lot more in North Louisiana, and there's some question as to how bad smuts are in upland conditions, you need to apply the fungicide at boot, about a 2 to 4 inch panicle in the boot. This is kind of counterintuitive because fall smut and kernel smut are heading diseases, but you need to get that fungicide out at boot. I don't know if we're knocking out the inoculum early on so it won't infect the head, or it gives the fungicide enough time to get into the head to protect the head, but a heading application will not control the smuts. You don't have much problems with Cercospora, but again, a boot to heading application has very good activity against that disease. The other disease is bacterial panicle blight. One of the things is we have some very high temperatures right now. It's getting up to 95 degrees and higher. Typically these diseases sheath blight, blast, Cercospora slow down under those conditions. When you get high temperatures during the day and night, that's not favorable for disease development. Another disease though takes over, and that's bacterial panicle blight. It's the only bacterial disease that we have that we don't have any chemical activity. Fungicides don't work against bacterial panicle blight. They work against fungi, not bacteria. So there are some compounds that have activity against it. Just be very careful. And the big problem is you don't have a scouting method for bacterial panicle blight, so you have to put it out preventatively, and that's one of the problems with that disease. We have a lot of resistance. Again, know the resistance of your variety. No rice variety is resistant to all the diseases, and typically you're going to have problems with the very susceptible and susceptible varieties. If you start getting into moderately susceptible, moderately resistant, and resistant variety, those diseases aren't going to be much of a problem. So make sure you know the resistance level of the variety and then manage it correctly to reduce disease. I want to thank everyone for their support to the Rice Research Board. Without that, all of this research really wouldn't be done. It really helps out. It's a third of our budget on station, and we really appreciate your support. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I think they're going to put my contact information. I'd love to hear from you, answer any questions you have. Email me, call me, text me, and we'll try to handle any problems you have. Thank you.